Hello, church. This is Randy Dupuy, and I'm recording this for Wednesday, June 10th, 2020. I've been listening to a podcast series called the Bama Podcast, and it's hosted and co-hosted by a couple of gentlemen from the West Coast. Sarah Alcon introduced me to this podcast series 6 months or so ago, and I try to listen to it when I'm driving in my truck to and from work on occasion. I started where they started in Genesis, and it's been going on for several years. I'm still in the Old Testament, but there was a section of podcasts that I would like to share with you that I think the information might be helpful in what we're going through today. But this section or series of podcasts that were maybe 3 or 4 podcasts in length were about life in the desert. And when he's talking about life in the desert, he's talking about life in the desert, in the Middle East, around where Israel is. And he tries to give us an understanding of that desert. I've never been over to the Middle East or to Israel on any trips. I have lots of friends that have. And this group of people from this area has gone numerous times, and Marty, one of the hosts, teaches about the desert and in his Bible lessons. But one of the sections that he did do was life in the desert, and I found it very interesting. The only desert I've ever seen is here and around New Mexico and Arizona, and of course going towards California. Most of the time people think of real sand dunes and everything, but the deserts of Israel back then were, hilly with a lot of rocks and very little vegetation at all. But what Marty started out with was that the desert was for shepherds. And if we think about the Hebrews, and we know that they did have, many herds of sheep and goats and other stock, but what Marty was talking about was sheep, and he was talking about the shepherds back then and the shepherds now were mostly female, and there were some males, but mostly it was the females and typically the young girls or the daughters of the people that owned the sheep, and they would go out and herd these sheep and take them to food and water. And the sheep would follow their shepherd by voice. They didn't lead with sticks or their rod or their staff. That rod or staff was mainly used to probably fight off predators and other things, but they did not lead with their stick. They led with their voice. And the sheep trusted their shepherd's voice. They trusted it as if their life depended on it, because it really did. Because that shepherd would take them to food and take them to water, and they depended on that shepherd to live. They trusted him so much, and they obeyed him and just his voice, that shepherd at night, if he was to put his sheep in a fold with other shepherds' sheep, that in the morning when they call out their sheep, all the sheep go to their shepherd by the sound of their voice. They don't listen to anybody else, just that shepherd. And I suppose that if there was more than one shepherd, that they would listen to maybe 2 voices. But Marty gave the illustration that, and there is history of when a shepherd dies, the flock, pretty much is without a leader, and they don't listen to anybody else because they listened only to that shepherd. And with that was kind of an illustration of the trust that the sheep have. And if you think about our studies and in the New Testament, and Jesus talking about sheep, and the sheep only listened to his voice, and we are compared to being his sheep or his flock. And that is the type of trust that I think that we're supposed to have. He also talked about, many times that in addition to shepherding the sheep, the young women also sometimes watch their younger brothers or younger siblings. And he talked about having a photo when he went out there on his trips of one of the little shepherd girls having her little brother with him, and in his hand was a sling. And he went on to explain that the little boys, their sisters are shepherding, but the little boys are throwing rocks, and they throw hundreds, if not maybe thousands of rocks a day. Which, if you think about that, then we think about King David, and when he slew Goliath, and he hit him right in the center of the forehead with a rock with his sling. And that was probably because he was a young boy, and accompanying possibly his sister, herding the sheep, and he became really good at throwing rocks. And he went on to talk about the vegetation in the desert. As I mentioned before, the vegetation is very sparse, and he told us about 4 trees. They aren't very big trees, and they provide a little bit of shade. They're not a lot of shade, but just a little bit of shade. And so if you needed to get out of the sun, there would be just enough shade to cover maybe one person, but it would be just enough for you. And he went on to talk about water and how that was gathered. The wadis that dig the crevices through the desert, and they're very deep and they're very rocky, and they're seasonal when the rains come, and that provides water, and it fills up the cisterns or the wells that they use throughout the year then to get water and to water their livestock. And then he also talked about the community. And in the desert, the people had to learn to take care of one another and to care for one another so that they would be cared for as well. In the desert, when they farmed, they would have terraced farms so that each farmer had a terrace of his own, and then down below him, a farmer might have had another terrace, and then another one below him, and another one below him. And the way that they watered their fields would be by rainwater, and then that water would cascade from one terrace down to another, And it all depended on the upkeep of the terraced retaining wall up above you. And so therefore, the neighbors would be responsible to each other. The neighbor above you would be responsible for maintaining his retaining wall and keeping it in good repair so it would not flood out the neighbor below him, but he couldn't see his retaining wall, but his neighbor below him could. So it was up to his neighbor below him to let his upper neighbor know that his wall was in disrepair and he needed to fix it. And so it was a give and take way of living back then, but it was just kind of an example of community. When you think about God's people and they're in that area of the world, and you're wondering why would God put his people in such an arid desert place like that when there's so many other places in the world that would seem to Western thinkers like us more desirable. There's lush fields, there's places where it does rain often, there's abundance of water, crops that are easy to grow, but in the desert, why would you put your chosen people in the desert? And so all this illustration led up to God put his people in the desert to learn how to trust him. Because there wasn't a lot of food, a lot of water, a lot of forage for their sheep, and things like that, shade, that in order for them to live in the desert, they had to trust. They had to trust in God. And if they didn't trust in God, they would perish. And so God would provide just enough. He didn't give them an abundance, but he gave them just enough. And if you think about the Israelites when they left Egypt and Moses led them through the desert, if we remember, Moses fled Egypt and went out to the desert and became a shepherd. And there he spent 40 years in the desert, learning about the desert. And what better person would be than for Moses to lead God's people through the desert for the next 40 years. And we know that this is how God prepared his people to inherit the promised land and to trust him, because they were wandering around the desert. There wasn't a lot of water, there wasn't food. God provided them all that. He led them through the desert. And so God uses the desert to train his people to trust him. Now, if we fast forward to right now, what we're experiencing right now, as Walter said on Sunday, this was the 13th Sunday that we haven't met together. And now heading towards our 14th. And this COVID-19, that has been going around has changed all of our lives in numerous ways. And if you think about it, we went from a country that pretty much had everything at our disposal. We could go when we wanted to go. We could go where we wanted to go. If we wanted to go to the store and buy groceries, we went to the store and we bought groceries. We walked right in. We walked in without a mask. Now, we are restricted. There's been stay-at-home orders for now, a little over 3 months. And if you do go, you can go, but you may have to wait in a line to get into the store. And then you can only buy certain things if they're even in stock at the store. Our way of life has changed dramatically and significantly in the last few months because of this pandemic. And then on top of that, now we're dealing with the death of George Floyd. And now that is even more pressure and tension that they're realizing. I'm thinking about all the emotions and all the feelings of the people that I've talked to during this pandemic, and even now after the death of George Floyd. And if you think about it, if there's uncertainty, there's fear, there's concern, anxiety, frustration, anger, depression, sadness, compassion, hope, and in the case of George Floyd, now there's hate. All these different emotions and feelings, and there's some people that go through several of these during different times, depending on what they're watching on TV or what they're experiencing. And at this time, nobody we're uncertain about the future. We don't know how this is going to affect us personally, our families, our church, our government, our way of life. We don't know what the impact or what the long-term ramifications of this is going to be. And I think this might be a desert moment for the United States and the world, for that matter, to have trust in something, because nobody knows the answers. God knows the answers. God is in control of everything. And I think this is teaching us that we need to trust in God, that all the anxiety and the worry and everything isn't going to do any of us any good. We need to trust in God. And I think this desert lesson, once when I thought about it, that it was pretty applicable. And I think that God even gives us individual deserts, depending on who we are and what we need in order to trust Him. And so that really hit home for me lately about dealing with this COVID and everything, that, out of all this, maybe it'll make us trust God a little bit more because of all the uncertainty and the way our lives have changed. The one thing that is certain and the one thing that we can trust is God. Thank you.